been separated in time.
Do you remember the first time you watched The Time Tunnel? Back then, all we saw were two men hurled into history, each episode a battlefield, a disaster, a moment stamped and sealed by time. And we watched with a strangely comforting sense of certainty. If history still exists, then surely they must survive. But the more you revisit it, the more you notice details you completely missed years ago. Did you ever realise the series spent $4 million on a single pilot episode? Or that the two lead actors hated each other so much in real life they had to be filmed separately and stitched together afterward? Or that it was a government-funded project, yet no one took responsibility when everything veered wildly off course? Today, we're reopening 12 dark secrets that the Time Tunnel kept well hidden, a series born from absolute faith in science and ending with no one knowing how to get anyone back home. 12. A series born of financial madness.
They've been separated in time.
Back then, when the Time Tunnel first aired, few people thought about money. We only saw a spiralling tunnel, flickering lights, two men vanishing into history. Everything looked perfectly television, grand enough to amaze, familiar enough to believe it could last. Behind that comforting illusion, however, was a number that stunned the entire television industry: $4 million for a single pilot episode. In 1966, that wasn't ambition. That was recklessness. No television pilot had ever cost that much. In fact, many full-season series never came close. Irwin Allen built an enormous set, the largest time tunnel ever seen on television, as if he were making an endlessly long feature film, not a weekly broadcast. Every episode that followed continued to burn money at an alarming rate. The average cost was roughly double the industry norm. Lighting systems, models, effects, props, everything was pushed to a level no one had tried before. And ABC, the network behind it all, slowly realised what it had actually bet on. The irony. The Time Tunnel didn't fail outright. Its ratings were decent. Viewers tuned in regularly. There was no spectacular collapse. But that very lack of explosion made things dangerous. When a series costs that much, it's not allowed to be merely fine. It has to become a phenomenon. Even before the Time Tunnel had a chance to prove how far it could go, fear crept into ABC's boardroom. Not fear of the story, not fear of audiences turning away, but fear of a financial machine that had spun out of control with no safe exit in sight. 11. American science as an uncontrolled monster.
That's after the explosion. Farther inland, on Java.
As a child, I watched the Time Tunnel with a simple, instinctive faith. On the other end of the tunnel, someone was always in control. Rooms filled with monitors, people reading data, decisions made in steady, confident voices. Science in that world felt like an invisible but reliable hand, always knowing when to press the button, when to pull someone back. Looking back though, the Time Tunnel tells a quieter, darker story. It isn't about humans controlling science. It's about science running itself. The Time Tunnel project is government-funded, existing as a strategic program outside ordinary life. But when disasters happen, when people are trapped in history, when errors appear, no one truly takes responsibility. Life and death decisions don't come from conscience or ethics. They come from systems, from data, from algorithms that are never asked whether they are right or wrong. This is a striking metaphor for Cold War-era America. Massive military programs. Nuclear projects built on absolute faith in science and technocracy. Humans create systems, then hand them full authority. In the Time Tunnel, there is no traditional villain. No shadowy figure laughing maniacally, just a machine that is trusted too much. And the most unsettling part, the show never names that fear. It simply lets you see the consequences people sent away, trapped reduced to variables in a calculation far larger than themselves. Science, once a tool meant to serve humanity quietly, becomes something that consumes its creators, very quietly and very American. 10. The two leads who hated each other in real life.
You all right? Where are we?
Do we have a reading on the time zone there?
You're surely familiar with Tony Newman and Doug Phillips as partners. They trust each other. They protect each other. They survive history together. Behind the camera, however, the story was entirely different. James Darren came into the time tunnel as a former teen idol. To him, television science fiction was a step down a cheap role compared to the image he once had. Robert Colbert was the opposite. A serious working actor grateful for a stable role in a major series. Two men, two positions, two completely opposing perspectives, and they couldn't stand each other. Between takes, they barely spoke. Dressing rooms were deliberately placed at opposite ends of the studio, not for convenience but to avoid eye contact. In some scenes, directors were forced to film them separately and stitch the shots together in post-production, pretending they were standing side by side. The tension on set was so thick that other cast members still recalled it vividly years later. The irony audiences never noticed. On screen, they remained a convincing duo. Professionalism, or more accurately enforced professionalism, created a kind of cold, precise chemistry. It didn't come from friendship, but from discipline. The time tunnel thus carries a strange paradox, a story about two people forced to travel together, told by two actors who wanted nothing more than to stay as far apart as possible. And perhaps that real-life conflict unintentionally reflected the spirit of the show itself, people pushed together by a system on a journey they never truly chose. 9. Recycled sets, the first sign of crisis.
Looks like ours.
The control banks are similar.
Power unit. A lot of the computers are missing.
When you first watched The Time Tunnel, you probably never noticed this. Everything looked new, modern, scientific. But look closer or rewatch it years later and a strange feeling emerges. Those control panels seem familiar. Those blinking lights feel oddly recognizable. And that's because they were. Most of the Time Tunnel's sets weren't newly built. Irwin Allen reused props, control panels and equipment from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and his other series. Control rooms that once belonged to submarines were simply re-angled, relit and given new names. Only the spiralling tunnel, the visual symbol of the entire show, was completely new. Everything around it was a patchwork. At first, this was a smart solution: save money, maximize resources, work faster. But over time, the recycling became obvious. Sharp-eyed viewers began noticing the same control panels appearing across different series, changed only by context and dialogue. Within the industry, people joked about Irwin Allen's travelling props items that packed their bags and moved from show to show. The key point is this: the Time Tunnel didn't recycle out of laziness. It recycled because it had already spent too much money up front. Once the budget was burned on the pilot and the massive set every subsequent episode had to improvise. The recycled sets were the first visible sign that the production machine was starting to lose steam. On the surface, the Time Tunnel still looked enormous. Inside it had already begun patching itself together just to survive. 8. ABC's censorship of violence and history. In our memories, the Time Tunnel feels like a safe journey through history. War, disaster, death, all presented just enough, not too frightening, not too heavy. What we don't see is what was cut away. Throughout its broadcast run, ABC subjected the time tunnel to strict censorship. Episodes involving Custer's Last, Stand the Alamo, or World War I were heavily edited. Firing squads, direct portrayals of death. These moments were deemed unsuitable for family audiences. To the network, history had to be made safe. Not shocking, not disturbing, not uncomfortable. Irwin Allen disagreed. He believed history could not be softened without losing its meaning. War, he argued, was not something that could be told through clean, sanitized images. ABC did not relent. As a result, many episodes aired in severely cut-down versions. Key scenes vanished. Emotional beats were removed, and worse still, some footage was erased permanently. Not archived, not restored, not preserved in any later versions. When watching the time tunnel today, you can feel these strange gaps. Historical moments that seem to run out of breath. Climaxes that arrive too quickly then disappear. This isn't a storytelling flaw. It's the trace of a struggle between someone who wanted to tell history as it truly was and a system that allowed history to exist only when it didn't make anyone uncomfortable. 7. Nuclear fear, encoded in the future episodes. Have you ever noticed this in the time tunnel whenever the story jumps into the future? That world is always in ruins, cities abandoned, society collapsed, survivors living in fear. And what's striking is this: there is never a clear explanation. No one mentions nuclear bombs. No one talks about World War. There are no warning speeches at all. But audiences in 1966 didn't need it spelled out. They understood. In the context of the Cold War, nuclear fear was not something television could address directly. The time tunnel found another way, encoding it beneath the surface of science fiction. The future isn't destroyed by monsters, not by aliens, but by an unnamed catastrophe whose origin everyone could guess. That was how American television protected itself at the time, saying the unspeakable in a language indirect enough to make it to air. The time tunnel, therefore, wasn't just telling stories about time travel. It reflected a collective anxiety. If the arms race continued, then the future, whatever name you gave it, would be nothing but rubble. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the show never offered a solution. It only showed the consequences, like a quiet warning sent from an era that didn't dare speak its greatest fear out loud. 6. The Titanic episode unsettlingly accurate. Many people still remember how the Titanic episode of the time tunnel felt. It wasn't like the others. No familiar breakneck pace, no clear last-second escape. Instead, there was a heavy atmosphere, as if the show knew perfectly well this time history wasn't going to save anyone. Even as children, we sense that difference. The ship drifts slowly. The dialogue feels unusually real, almost unperformed. And time, normally bent and twisted throughout the series, moves forward with frightening precision. The reason only became clear later. The script for Rendezvous with Yesterday was built from real survivor accounts. The writers studied inquiry records, memoirs, and eyewitness testimony. Many lines of dialogue are near verbatim quotations. The timeline impact with the iceberg engines stopping evacuation was recreated with a level of accuracy rare for television in 1966. Titanic historians at the time openly praised the episode, even while noting a few fictional additions for dramatic effect. But it was that respect for history that made the episode so haunting. For once, the time tunnel didn't try to fix the past. It simply watched. Audience response was unmistakable. This became the highest-rated episode of the entire series, perhaps because in a show that usually treated history as an adventure, set the Titanic episode abruptly turned into a cold reminder there are moments where science, time, and even faith itself are powerless. 5. The Pearl Harbor Controversy.
The Japanese are going to attack in less than half an hour. We can't just stand here and let this happen.
Jerry, it did happen.
Before the Time Tunnel's Pearl Harbor episode ever reached the air, trouble had already begun. Not from viewers, but from diplomacy. When ABC announced plans to produce an episode about the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese government formally objected. They argued that dramatizing the event on American television would damage bilateral relations and reopen unhealed wartime wounds. Peace advocacy groups in both the US and Japan also called for the episode to be cancelled. For the first time, the Time Tunnel became more than a TV series, it became a political issue. ABC panicked. The network forced Irwin Allen to soften the script. Details that could be interpreted as anti-Japanese were cut or altered. The final version emphasized tragedy on both sides and avoided assigning direct blame. The episode aired on December 11, 1966, exactly 25 years after the attack. The backlash was immediate. Letters of protest, angry responses, demands for explanations. Despite being toned down, the episode remained unacceptable to many viewers. And precisely because of that, it exposed the limits of American television. At the time, history was only allowed to appear if it didn't make people uncomfortable for too long. Once again, the Time Tunnel made its point clear: time travel was acceptable. Touching collective memory, especially the memory of war, was something else entirely. 4. Whit Bissell played multiple roles because they ran out of money.
You brought him back 10 years ago.
We didn't. It just happened, a fluke. But if he's this close, Ray, we've got to close a 10-year gap before we lose him.
If you watch the Time Tunnel closely enough, there's a strange moment when you realise you've seen that face before. Whit Bissell appears throughout the series as Dr. Raymond Swain, a familiar, trustworthy presence anchored in the present. But then, in another episode, he shows up in the past, as a completely different character, then again, and again. In total, Whit Bissell played 4 separate roles, not as an artistic choice, not as a meditation on reincarnation, but because the money was gone. The budget no longer allowed for enough guest actors in historical settings. The cheapest solution was to reuse the ones they already had. The problem was the series barely tried to hide it. Minimal makeup, familiar camera angles, the same unmistakable voice. Viewers noticed immediately. The press noticed immediately. A tongue-in-cheek piece in TV Guide joked about Whit Bissell's time-travelling family tree. Behind the scenes, even the cast found it awkward. Irwin Allen tried to argue that many people throughout history simply looked alike. No one really bought it. This small detail spoke volumes. The Time Tunnel had gone from a grand, ambitious project to one forced to survive on solutions no one wanted to talk about. And when a show resorts to choices like this, audiences may laugh. But behind that laughter lies a clear truth. The machine was now running on inertia, no longer fueled enough to maintain its original seriousness. 3. The effects team that raised a Star Wars generation.
2 American scientists are lost in the swirling maze of past and future ages during the first experiments on America's greatest and most secret project, the Time Tunnel.
Back then, watching the Time Tunnel, we couldn't quite name what pulled us in. Just a familiar sensation spiralling, light-warped space, 2 men torn from the present. The effect wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect, but it was convincing enough to make us believe they had truly left time behind. What few people knew was that behind those seemingly simple images, a technical foundation was quietly forming. The effects team on the Time Tunnel, led by Bill Abbott, worked under constant budget pressure. No cutting-edge technology, no luxury equipment, just imagination and the necessity to innovate. The iconic time vortex effect was created with an almost crude solution, a hand-painted circular disc spun by a motor filmed through rippled glass. Simple, effective. Among that team was a then unknown name, John Dykstra. He learned compositing, optical printing and model photography not in a state-of-the-art lab, but on a television series struggling to stay afloat. Those constraints taught him a crucial mindset how to extract maximum impact from minimal resources. A decade later, he carried that mindset into Star Wars and permanently changed how cinema approached visual effects. Many techniques used in Star Wars trace their roots back to the days of the time tunnel. The irony is hard to miss. A series remembered as a financial failure quietly became the cradle of one of the greatest visual revolutions in film history. The time tunnel never managed to bring its characters home, but it sent an entire generation of filmmakers very, very far. 2. Irwin Allen never wanted two main characters.
This way! That's blocked off here. Go the other way. Hey, you! Get out of here!
When watching The Time Tunnel, we grow used to seeing two men thrown into history together. They support each other, they argue, and quite often they save each other. But that structure was never the original idea. Irwin Allen envisioned something simpler and sharper, a single man trapped in time. One person facing history alone, facing isolation, responsibility, and the consequences of every intervention. ABC rejected it. By television logic, two leads were easier to sell, easier dialogue, easier audience retention. Allen agreed but never truly made peace with the choice. The imbalance slowly surfaced in the scripts. Tony Newman, James Darren was favoured more dialogue, more heroic moments. Doug Phillips. Robert Culber was gradually pushed into the background even though his name still appeared alongside Darren's on the posters. This wasn't just a personal issue. It affected the structure of the entire series. Two protagonists meant two lives that always had to be preserved. And so the writing fell into a loop. One man in danger, the other rescues him, and both are thrown forward again. Allen later admitted he found writing for two time travelers forced, limiting and dramatically diluted. By then, however, the series no longer had time to fix it. The time tunnel thus carries a built-in paradox, a story about loss of control told through a structure the creator himself never truly believed in. 1. A proper ending that was rejected.
Остановите их.
Do you remember the ending of the time tunnel, that sense of emptiness? The two men fall into history once again. The screen cuts to black, and everything stops as if no promise had ever been made. But the truth is Irwin Allen did write an ending. A script titled Return to the Future finally brings Tony and Doug home. They succeed, they return, only to discover something far worse, the timeline they knew no longer exists. Because of their repeated interventions, history has diverged. The Time Tunnel project never happened. Dr. Anne McGregor doesn't recognise them. They stand in a present that is utterly foreign, like people who were never meant to belong there. The ending offers no comfort. Only a lingering question, would they dare to jump into time one more time to fix everything? ABC rejected the script. Too dark, too complex, unsuitable for family television. And so, the time tunnel ended. Without an ending. No reunion, no homecoming, no answers. Perhaps that was the most fitting conclusion possible. A story about science running beyond control, about decisions made without considering consequences, and about people trapped inside a system simply because no one dared to turn it off. A journey launched on faith and ending with no way back. Looking back at the time tunnel today, it's no longer just an old 1960s science fiction series. It feels more like an early snapshot of modern America, an era that placed absolute faith in science, believed that with enough data, every risk could be controlled, and assumed that if something went wrong, the system would correct itself. The two main characters never make it home, not because they aren't smart enough, but because there was never a real plan to bring them back. Perhaps that's why the time tunnel lingers in our memory longer than many more successful series. It doesn't offer a satisfying ending. It leaves behind a quiet feeling that some journeys begin with beautiful faith, yet end in silence. If this show was part of your childhood, leave a comment about the detail that impressed you the most. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos.